Incensed by the death of another black man at the hands of police, they refuse to remain silent. Protesters filling Long Island streets as they call for an end to police brutality and racial inequality. Demonstrators are demanding justice and change in the wake of the death of George Floyd and now Rayshard Brooks. Well, tonight we bring you an in-depth look at unrest in America, a special report. My guests tonight are Elaine Gross, the founder and president of EraseRacism. That's a regional civil rights organization based here on Long Island. Also joining us momentarily will be Fred Brewington, a civil rights attorney. Thank you. We'll begin with you, Elaine. I know that Fred is going to be joining us quickly. Are we ready? Are we ready, Elaine, to have that candid conversation about racial inequality, police reforms, educational reforms, healthcare? Are we ready to actually listen to each other?
Well, I think some people are definitely ready, and others aren't, but they just have to be brought along. Okay.
Well, the governor recently, and he got a lot of pushback for this, he said, quote, there is no trust between the community and the police right now. Do you agree with that there's no trust?
There is tremendous amount of distrust, not just from Black or African American members of the community, but as we've seen from the protests, there are a lot of different kinds of people who have finally caught on to what has been going on. And so there is distrust. I don't want to use sweeping terms to say that nobody trusts the police, but I do want to be clear that there is a serious problem.
Okay. Let's bring in Fred Brewington, civil rights attorney. He's joining us now. Thank you for your time, Fred. I know we had some trouble getting the connection there. Let me bring you into this conversation now. We're talking about police reforms right now. The governor recently signed, today actually signed a police reform law that reporting within 6 hours when they discharge their weapon, requiring courts to compile and publish racial and other democratic data of low-level offenses, and to provide medical and mental health attention to individuals in custody. And that falls short of what some people have been discussing here across the nation, across the globe, here on Long Island. Is this for show? Does this go far enough?
Well, those are two different questions. The question of whether or not it goes far enough, the answer to that is no, but this is not the end. This is just the beginning. There are a number of pieces of legislation that have yet to be dealt with by the Senate and by the Assembly and then to the governor's desk. But this is definitely a start. Going back to the question you asked Elaine a little earlier about the issue of trust. The trust is earned. And in this situation, the question of whether or not police have earned the trust of major portions of the community is really what's in the balance right now. Elaine Gross from EraseRacism made it very clear that there are people from all walks of life, all ilks of our community are part of the protests that are recognizing that the value which has been placed on African American lives in the past is one that was consistent with what the Supreme Court said back in Plessy versus Ferguson and back in Dred Scott, that African American lives were not worth the same as white lives. And that misnomer, that falsehood is now coming to fore with communities coming together shoulder to shoulder to raise questions of inequality.
Yeah, and we should just remind the viewers, if they don't know, Plessy v. Ferguson established the separate but equal doctrine, which established really the Jim Crow laws that just spread throughout the South up until Brown versus Board in the 50s.
Some folks say that Jim Crow is still alive and well. And I'm one of those individuals that implores everybody to read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, to really look at where we are in the 21st century. Okay,
so the governor today, when he was announcing this new law, and I'll put this to both of you, he called the system, the criminal justice system, and really the policing system, broken and unfair, an unfair system. Is it broken and is it unfair? I mean, those are two different things. Is it just unfair and not broken, or is it broken at this point?
Elaine,
why don't you take that first?
Sure. I would say that it is definitely broken from the standpoint of it was never aimed at providing public safety to Black people. We have to keep in mind that the reason why we had police and whatever they called them earlier on was actually to catch Black people who were, runaway slaves. It was all about protecting the slave owners from Black people. And then as we went along, whether it was Jim Crow or after that or now, it's not about protecting Black people. It's about protecting white people against the enemy, and the enemy is Black people. So it's broken. It's doing what it's supposed to do, or what it was designed to do, but it's broken from the standpoint of the values that we espouse, what America hopes to be. And so, and that is in a very fundamental way unfair.
Okay, Fred, if it is broken, is defund or disband the right alternative? Is the direction we should be going in?
Well, Stone, I think it's important to first, you can't expect justice to come from an unjust and unjust process. And that's where the issue of fairness, which is really not the term that should be used. The question is there equity in the system, and is there a even playing field when it comes to all aspects of life that then impact this one component of society? And the answer to that question is no, there is no equity, because we know that from education to healthcare to employment to housing, there are inequities that exist in the system, and they are designed as a process that came from a time when the United States was built on the labor and backs of individuals that were forced immigrants into this nation, and are now the backbone of the nation on every aspect, including economy. So the real question is, can it be fixed? The answer is no. It is not in the term of defunding the police, oftentimes is misunderstood. The issue here is not just defunding the police just to wipe them off the map. There is room for the need for policing, but it has to be in a new and appropriate way. It can't be just rebuilt or restructured. So the defunding of police deals with the redistribution of funds to areas that are going to help change the rudimentary concerns that lead to people being engaged in the criminal system. And those are the things that require the tough discussions that you spoke about at the top of the show.
Are we ready to listen to that? I mean, when you look at the protests out there, this organic groundswell, you see people of all colors and all backgrounds, it seems like. Is this different? Are we starting to listen to each other?
Well, we're in a different time, certainly. I mean, the confluence of what's taken place, us coming through the pandemic and seeing what we can do when we put our mind to it. I mean, that was enormous what we've done over the past 3 months. I mean, no one can downplay that. And then the realization that we saw George Floyd, and it's important to say his name every time we speak about this, George Floyd's life being taken from him under the knee of someone who was supposed to protect and serve, and in this situation choked the life out of another human being while smirking on camera. That individual stood in front of the entire world for them to see as this life was snuffed out. And the reality is that we have to be now in the process of realizing that people that didn't think it would affect them were affected. They saw it come into their living rooms, just like we saw things happening in Birmingham, Alabama, coming into their living rooms. But this time, it came into their hands because it was on their phones. It was on their tablets. And there's the confluence of facts that bring us to this point have been basically ignited by George Floyd's death. And we are ready. The question is, are we ready not only to listen, but are we ready to act? And that's where governmental officials and those who are elected, not the Johnny-come-latelys, but the people that are really ready to get down, roll up their sleeves, and perhaps risk not being reelected because they have to buck the police systems or buck the police unions and go at this with the fervor that every aspect of what needs to take place now, not tomorrow.
Okay, Elaine, let me ask you this. You hear counter protesters, I don't want to really call them that, but other people that are on the other side of the protest screaming Blue Lives Matter. And a lot of people say that. When you say Black Lives Matter, shouldn't we be saying all lives matter and Black Lives Matter as well? I mean, including in that?
So in order for people to understand why Black Lives Matter is absolutely appropriate, they really have to understand our history. And too often we are very ahistorical. And so it's only if you realize that and Fred was talking about from slavery, it was clear always that Black lives did not matter. We were never given the recognition of being a full human being. And so in that context, you don't talk about all lives, you talk about the fact that Black lives have consistently been marginalized, consistently been discriminated against and killed. And so absolutely, we have to state very clearly that Black lives matter, because even now there are people in the highest offices that make it clear that Black lives don't matter.
Okay, we're going to take a real quick break. I have to stop it right there. Great discussion so far. More discussion on unrest in America right after this. Welcome back to our special report, Unrest in America. Let's bring back in my guest, Fred Brewington, a civil rights attorney, and Elaine Gross, the founder and president of Erase Racism here on Long Island. All these topics we could talk for hours on, and we should be having these discussions. But let's kind of piggyback on something Fred said earlier when he was talking about the racism that goes on in healthcare and in education and the different in criminal justice system. Is it possible to have structural racism where you don't have racists running it? And Elaine, let's start with you.
Sure. That's what's so insidious about structural racism, is that you can have, in fact, bystanders, people that are totally unaware of what's going on. And you can also have people that are manipulating in ways to keep structural racism in place. What happens is, when we talk about every aspect of life, look at our schools on Long Island, 125 school districts. Someone asked me recently about AP IB courses. And in fact, on average, you have 35 AP or IB courses for white schools and 22 for Black students. And that's because the courses are not offered in the same way in Black schools as they are in white schools. That doesn't have anything to do with students not wanting to take those courses. That has to do with the hoarding of resources in white schools rather than Black schools. So there are, we could go through a whole range of statistics that both point out the disparities and also show what is really causing that, what is behind those disparities. And in that case, we're talking about various public policies, various laws, various practices, even culture that is keeping the perpetuation of structural racism, which disadvantages people of color and provides additional resources and advantages to white people.
Okay.
Stone, if I can just jump in, one of the things that you heard Elaine use a phrase, white schools versus Black schools. And in that term, she's referring, I think, to the facts that we have segregation even in our schools and in our housing on Long Island. We know that Long Island is one of the most segregated suburban communities in the country. That is a root cause. That leads to the institutional and structural discrimination that we refer to as racism that shows itself over and over again. And if we didn't have anything as a better measure, we only look need to look at the disparities in healthcare when we look at the deaths and the sicknesses that come from COVID-19. The concentration in the African American communities and in the Latino communities are far outweighed in terms of number and percentage those that fell into communities that were white communities. And as a result of that, that's a direct relationship. It has a impactful nature in terms of looking at the disparities in healthcare. So yeah, this is what needs to happen. And how does it happen? It doesn't happen simply because we say we want it to. It happens because we have to really focus on making those who make the decisions come to the table and start to dismantle this monster. It is a monster, and America has been sick for a very long time.
Yeah, Elaine, how do we have that conversation? I mean, and I mean that seriously. Like, how do you tell somebody that, look, you're not racist, but you're part of a system that has structural racism in it, without making that person feel defensive? How do you respond to someone saying, look, I had a tough childhood too, and I'm not a racist?
Mm-hmm. So what we do is, in our training, we say pretty much what you just said, which is, it's not about, we're not talking about you and what you do or do not feel. What we're talking about is the reality of this system that we all live in. And so when people, and some people can't hear it, but a lot of people are able to hear it, when they do, then the light bulb comes on. And then they begin to question, wait a minute, I see that disparity. What is driving that? And with the right kind of research and with an open-mindedness, people are able to understand that with COVID-19, for example, you know, if you think about that education that we were talking about, the quality of education influences what kinds of jobs you get to get. That influences whether or not you are part of that essential worker. The data tells us that there are more Blacks and Latinx folks who have been going to work during this time when others of us have been home. So they're exposed. They're out in the world. They're exposed to the virus. They're more likely to have the virus. And then with the underlying health conditions that Fred was talking about, you combine those things, and they're more likely to die from COVID rather than to recover. So that is what, an example of how these different areas of our lives really play a role together. It's a cumulative and compounding effect when we're talking about structural racism. Okay, it's not any one.
I'm going to have to leave it right there. This has been, at least I hope we've continued to broach the conversation. I know it's a conversation that needs to continue for a long time. I want to thank both of you for your candid words and talking with us about that. Elaine Gross, Fred Brewington, thank you very much. And tomorrow night, we will continue this discussion with us. So join us then as we do Unrest in America, Community Conversation. News 12's Rich Barabi will host a Facebook Live town hall program beginning at 7. We'll have a panel of Long Island experts discussing race relations, social justice, and policing again. But then again, that is going to be on the News 12 Long Island Facebook page. Again, thank you very much for Fred Brewington, Elaine Gross, and thank you for watching our Unrest in America, our special report. I'm Stone Grissom. Good night.